name is going on over there?
The film Move Over Darling harks right back to the middle years of the 19th century with the poem Enoch Arden by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It was enormously popular. It sold over 60,000 copies in the first year, which even for a poetry reading age like the 19th century was still a huge score. But of course it goes back to the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus who goes away for 10 years, comes back, drives away the suitors from his wife and reinstates himself as ruler and husband and father. The first film is a film called Enoch Arden. And then in 1940, My Favourite Wife.
When I was a little girl in Sweden, I went once to the movies. And poor Cary Grant thought his first wife was dead, so he married another lady.
My Favourite Wife was a film starring Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. It was one of the so-called screwball comedies that Grant and Dunne, for that matter, became famous for.
But Irene Dunne, who was the first wife, she come back.
Well, I think they made a story of pathos into a farce.
Movies. When do movies ever reflect real life?
The original film had the idea of making a twist and having the Enoch Arden character actually be a woman and a wife and a mother. So Ellen Arden, as she became known, was played by Irene Dunne, and the film opens with Irene Dunne coming back from the dead, as it were. In fact, the opening scene in all of the films, in My Favourite Wife, Something's Got to Give, and then Move Over Darling, all of them open with a comic setup in the courtroom.
Good morning, sir. It's very kind of you
Just
to...
a moment. Wasn't I supposed to marry somebody?
Where are they? Wasn't that for today?
If Your Honor, please.
Just be still.
Nick Arden is trying to have his wife declared legally dead so that he can marry the second Mrs. Arden.
Are you Arden?
I am, Your Honor.
Well, Mr. Arden, as I understand it, your wife, Ellen Wagstaff Arden.
This is a petition to have her declared legally dead.
Is that what it says in here?
By the time Something's Got to Give began in the spring of 1962, Marilyn was the biggest star in the world for a good solid decade and had been dominating the headlines, although famously just in the weeks leading up to Something's Got to Give, she had been vying for space in the headlines with her longtime rival at Fox, Elizabeth Taylor. But she famously had been having personal and professional problems. Her last few films had not been successful. The last film that she had made that was a big hit was Some Like It Hot, which was in 1959. So it had been 3 years since she'd had a big hit. And then she made Let's Make Love, which was a huge flop. She hadn't made a film for a year. Her last two films had not been well received. So certainly she had something to prove. The film didn't get finished for several reasons, and it depends on who you talk to, which reason you think was ultimately, the deal breaker. The official reason why Fox fired Marilyn on June 8th, after about 3 months of production, was chronic absenteeism. She'd shown up for 13 out of 33 days of filming, and this was true. On the other hand, Marilyn insisted that she had sinusitis and a virus infection, and her doctors confirmed that. Producers thought she was malingering, that there was nothing wrong with her, except that she was taking too many drugs and not showing up on set. On the other hand, there's another story which has been emerging in the last 10 or 15 years, which has to do not with Marilyn's problems, but with Fox's problems. Now, at the same time that Fox was making Something's Got to Give, they were also making another film with their other big female star of the day, Elizabeth Taylor, and that, of course, was Cleopatra. Fox was basically throwing money into that picture in the hopes of saving it, and it was incredibly extravagant, being shot on location with, kind of no holds barred. Elizabeth Taylor was being paid 10 times what Marilyn was paid on salary. She had $1 million contract for Cleopatra. Richard Burton was being paid a lot of money. They were, of course, not showing up because of their off-screen shenanigans. And then Taylor got pneumonia, which further delayed production. And Fox was facing bankruptcy. They had sunk everything into Cleopatra, and they were banking on Cleopatra and Something's Got to Give to reverse their fortunes, to use their two biggest movie stars, Taylor and Monroe, and let that save the day. Now, the reason why Monroe became particularly important to this financial problem was that they actually had her on the cheap. Because they had this 7-year-old contract that she had to finish, they had her for $100,000. So they thought they were going to get this cheap comedy that was going to turn everything around. And what happened was they'd actually gotten to the point where they had shut down the commissary. Nobody was eating. They were selling off their back lots. They were shutting down productions on most other films at the time. So they were pretty clearly panicking, and they weren't thinking very clearly. They thought that by getting rid of Marilyn as the problem, they could replace her quickly and finish the film, and that turned out to be a miscalculation for a lot of reasons. After they fired Monroe, Fox tried to replace her quickly. After a couple of other actresses turned down the role, they gave it to Lee Remick, forgetting that Dean Martin had approval in his contract for his co-star. And Martin, who was a friend of Marilyn's, famously said, "No Marilyn, no picture," and also walked off the set. After Marilyn was fired, the battle lines that had been drawn remained, and basically there was a war of publicity, and they battled it out in the newspapers and in the magazines. On the one hand, you had certain people working for Fox who were putting out the word that that her career was over. Marilyn countered. And she came back with a publicity barrage of her own. She went to photographers and she went to the magazines, and she gave interviews for the first time in several years, including a big interview to Life magazine, which ironically would end up being the last interview that she gave, and appeared only the day before she died. So she was fired on June 8th, and she would die on the night of August 4th. Eventually, what happened, secretly, was that the studio realized that they were not going to be able to recoup their losses on Something's Got to Give without Marilyn, that they needed her star power, that they had lost Dean Martin as a consequence of firing her, that she did look great, that they had all of these costumes and all of this investment in her, and that she actually, when they looked at the footage, and we can now, luckily, we can view the footage and see that she's certainly not in, a narcotic haze.
I was afraid you'd misunderstand about that.
Oh, what's to misunderstand? A man's wife spends 5 years on an island with a strange man?
Would you like it any better if I knew him?
It would seem to be usable footage. As a consequence of all of this, Fox studio head Peter Levathes went back to Marilyn, and in secret they conducted some renegotiations, and Marilyn was hired back. The contract exists now. Peter Levathes hired her back for a 2-picture, $1 million deal. She died just a few days later. At that point, then, the project does just get shelved. Marilyn's death was an enormous shock. It was a shock to Hollywood. It was a shock to the studio. Clearly, people didn't see it coming. At that point, Fox had to tread pretty carefully. They couldn't very easily just slot somebody else in and churn out a film called Something's Got to Give. So they had to wait a decent interval. But they still had these financial problems that they were in. And so what they did was they put it aside for the time being, but they had a workable script. After waiting, Fox then decided that it really was in no financial position to keep this film on the shelf forever. And they had the sets, and they had things basically ready to go. And so they brought in 2 very bankable stars in Doris Day and James Garner, and they changed the title to Move Over Darling and released it about 1.5 years after Marilyn died.
The reason that they thought of Doris is because Doris spoofed the Marilyn Monroe image in the film that she had done previously with James Garner, The Thrill of It All. And that's another reason for James Garner in this, that Thrill of It All at Universal was so successful.
By the time Doris Day came to make Move Over Darling, she had really transitioned into these more adult romantic comedies that have much more in common with the earlier screwball comedies of the 1930s and 1940s. So there is a kind of logic to casting Doris Day in a remake of My Favorite Wife, because the Rock Hudson, Doris Day romantic comedies had been so incredibly successful just a few years before. I think it's a real lesson in how much a star persona affects the feel of a film, especially, I think, in the days of the great Hollywood movie stars, these people with such intense charisma and so much personality and the strong sense of an identity that was coming through. You really get three entirely different films. When you look at My Favorite Wife, the footage that we have of Something's Got to Give, and then eventually Move Over, Darling.
Win an all-expense trip to Hollywood, the glamorous film capital, to attend the gala world premiere of Doris Day's latest film, Do Not Disturb. Compete in the International Doris for a Day competition, and you may appear in Doris Day's next picture for 20th Century Fox.